Did you ever had that eerie feeling that someone or something was watching you? You're not alone. Before we uncover the terrifying truth, like this video and comment your location, let's step into the shadows together. I've been bartending in San Francisco for over 15 years, but nothing compares to what happened during my brief stint at the Compass Rose in North Beach. It was a historic establishment, housed in a narrow Victorian building from the 1800s with dark wood paneling and brass fixtures that had witnessed countless stories over the decades. I typically worked the late shift, from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m., and had grown accustomed to the usual parade of tourists, locals, and night owls that filtered through our doors. The incident occurred on a foggy Tuesday night in November. The bar was unusually quiet, with only a handful of regulars nursing their drinks. Around midnight, she walked in, a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a black cocktail dress that seemed oddly formal for a weeknight. She took a seat at the far end of the bar, partially obscured by shadows, where one of our vintage wall sconces had burned out the week before. "Manhattan, please. Extra bitter," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that made me pause. As I prepared her drink, I noticed her hands were shaking as she placed them flat against the bar top. Her fingernails were broken and dirty, as if she'd been digging in soil. I served her drink and watched as she downed it in 2 quick gulps, immediately signaling for another. Something about her seemed off, not in the usual way of someone who'd had too much to drink, but something deeper, more unsettling. Her eyes kept darting to the ancient mirror behind the bar, but she never seemed to be looking at her own reflection. By her third Manhattan, she'd begun to talk. "Do you believe in karma?" she asked, her words precise despite the alcohol. "The kind that follows you no matter how far you run." I gave her my standard bartender's non-committal shrug, but she continued as if I'd encouraged her. 5 years ago, I worked at a bar called the Golden Key in Sacramento. Beautiful place, all Art Deco inside. I was closing up one night when this guy came in, just before last call. He was desperate for a drink, said he'd had the worst day of his life. She paused, swirling the cherry in her glass. I should have turned him away. That's what the rules said. But he looked so broken, so I let him in, served him a whiskey, neat. He drank it, thanked me, and left. The next morning, I learned he'd driven his car off the Sacramento River Bridge. They found his body 3 days later. Her hand trembled as she lifted her glass again. That's when it started. Every bar I've worked at since then, someone comes in just before closing, always alone, always devastated. And no matter what I do, serve them or turn them away, they're dead by morning. 5 bars, 5 people. I quit bartending, but now I'm the one who keeps getting drawn to bars at closing time. Tonight, she glanced at her phone, displaying 1:45 a.m. Tonight, I think it's my turn. I tried to reassure her, offered to call her a cab or a friend, but she just smiled sadly and shook her head. As last call approached, she stood up, leaving cash on the bar. "Thank you for listening. Just, whatever you do, don't follow me outside. Don't try to help. It's better that way." She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Just before reaching the door, she turned back. "Check tomorrow's news. You'll see I was telling the truth. And please, if anyone ever comes in right before closing, remember my story." I watched her disappear into the fog through our front window. The next morning, I obsessively checked local news sites, but found nothing about any accidents or deaths. Relief flooded through me, until I got to work that evening and found a notice that the Golden Key in Sacramento had burned down overnight. The only casualty was an unidentified woman in a black cocktail dress, found in the basement where the original bar had been. The fire inspector's preliminary report suggested the blaze had started 5 years ago, smoldering undetected in the walls all this time. I still bartend, but I never serve anyone after 1:45 a.m. Some rules, I've learned, exist for reasons we're better off not questioning. The Thirsty Cactus was a dive bar in the outskirts of Palm Springs, the kind of place locals called home, and tourists never found. I started working there in the summer of 2019, mainly because the pay was decent and the owner didn't ask too many questions about my spotty resume. The regulars were a predictable bunch, retired snowbirds, desert rats, and the occasional lost soul, seeking refuge from the relentless California sun. Among them was Marcus, a man in his 60s who came in every Wednesday and Saturday at exactly 7:15 p.m. He always ordered the same thing, a bottle of Budweiser and a shot of Jack Daniels. He never spoke much, just nodded politely and left a generous tip. The other regulars seemed to know him, but something in their demeanor changed whenever he was around. Conversations would quiet, people would find reasons to move to the other end of the bar. I didn't understand why, until Gloria, our longest-serving waitress, finally filled me in. Marcus used to own this place, she whispered one slow afternoon. Back in the 90s, before the accident, his wife and daughter were killed by a drunk driver on their way home from here. The driver was one of our regulars, someone Marcus had served himself earlier that night. The story explained his somber presence, but not the way others reacted to him. When I pressed Gloria for more details, she hesitated. Thing is, Sugar, that drunk driver, he disappeared the next day. Car was found abandoned on the highway, but no body. Same thing happened to the responding officer who'd let the guy go, with just a warning earlier that evening when he'd been pulled over. Then the insurance investigator who ruled it an accident instead of negligent homicide, she vanished too. 3 people, all gone within a month. I watched Marcus more carefully after that. He never seemed threatening, just sad and tired. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I'd catch him staring at certain customers with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I started noting who drew his attention, and within a few weeks, I noticed a pattern. He only focused on people who'd had too much to drink and insisted on driving anyway. One night, a belligerent customer ignored our offers to call him a cab. As he stumbled toward the door, I saw Marcus stand up for the first time ever. He placed his half-finished beer on the bar and followed the drunk man out. Neither of them came back. The next Wednesday, Marcus was in his usual spot at 7:15 p.m. sharp, but something was different. His clothes were dirty, with what looked like reddish-brown stains on the cuffs. His hands, normally steady, trembled slightly as he lifted his shot glass. And there was something else, a satisfaction in his eyes I'd never seen before. That drunk customer was never found, but his car turned up 3 days later in a remote part of Joshua Tree National Park. The interior was spotless, professionally cleaned according to police, with no signs of foul play, just like all the others. I started keeping a list after that, tracking the people Marcus watched and the ones who subsequently disappeared. The numbers were impossible to ignore. In the 8 months I worked there, 7 people vanished. All of them had gotten behind the wheel drunk, all of them had caught Marcus's attention, and all of them were last seen leaving the Thirsty Cactus. The police investigated, of course, but they never found anything. How could they? Marcus was just an old man who drank quietly at a bar twice a week. The security cameras never showed him doing anything suspicious. The missing people had no connection to each other, and Marcus himself. His alibi was always perfect. He was always visible on camera, sitting at the bar. Except for those few minutes when he'd follow someone out. Those few crucial minutes when the exterior camera would mysteriously malfunction. I quit after I found something in the bar's basement while doing inventory. Hidden behind some old boxes was a collection of driver's licenses, dozens of them, spanning decades. Each one belonging to someone who had disappeared. But what truly terrified me wasn't the licenses themselves. It was the fact that they were arranged in neat rows, like trophies, each one bearing the same date of issue, the day Marcus's family died. I left Palm Springs the next day. Sometimes I check the local news, though, and every few months, another person vanishes from the Thirsty Cactus. The police have no leads. The cameras malfunction at crucial moments. And Marcus, he's still there, every Wednesday and Saturday at 7:15 p.m., watching. Working at the Redwood Lounge in Humboldt County meant getting used to strange characters, but nothing prepared me for what happened during the storm of 2023. We were about 20 miles outside of Eureka, surrounded by towering redwoods and fog so thick it felt like a physical presence. The bar itself was a century-old logging camp converted into a roadhouse, all rough-hewn beams and iron fixtures. That night, an atmospheric river was pounding the coast. The power had been flickering, and most sensible people were home. But we had 5 customers who'd braved the weather, a young couple on a road trip, an old logger who was a regular, and 2 women who'd pulled off the highway when driving became too dangerous. At 11:30 p.m., the sheriff called. Mudslides had blocked both directions of the highway. We were stuck until morning. I made the announcement, and everyone took it surprisingly well. We had plenty of food, backup generators, and the bar's owner lived upstairs. It would be like a surprise slumber party. That's when things started getting weird. First, the phones died, not just cells, but the landline too. Then our regular old Joe started acting strange. He kept staring at the wall behind the bar, muttering about shadows moving when they shouldn't. I'd known Joe for years and had never seen him like this. Around midnight, the young woman from the traveling couple went to use the bathroom. She came back white as a sheet. "There's someone else in the building," she said. I heard whistling in the hallway, but when I looked, no one was there. Her boyfriend laughed it off, but old Joe got agitated. "It's happening again," he said, "just like in '87. We pressed him for details, but he clammed up, ordering another whiskey with shaking hands. The owner, Dave, who'd come down to check on us, seemed equally uncomfortable. Finally, one of the stranded drivers, a woman named Sarah, convinced Joe to talk. "Back in 1987, there was another storm like this," he began. "Bar was full that night, maybe 15 people. Road got blocked just like now. Everyone stayed put, making the best of it. But when morning came..." He took a long drink. 3 people were dead. Hearts just stopped. No explanation. The weird thing was, their watches had all stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. Dave tried to change the subject, but Sarah's friend Rachel had already pulled out her phone. After a few minutes of searching, she looked up. "He's right. November 12th, 1987. 3 unexplained deaths at the Redwood Lounge. But there's more. It wasn't the first time. Same thing happened in 1953 and 1919. Every 34 years, old Joe whispered, and always during a storm." I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence or local legend, but the fear in Joe's eyes seemed too real. Dave appeared equally rattled, though he kept insisting it was just stories. The young couple, Mike and Amy, suggested we all leave despite the mudslides. Better to risk the weather than whatever this was. That's when the lights went out completely. The backup generator kicked in, but instead of the usual fluorescence, it only powered the old emergency lights, casting everything in a sickly red glow. In that crimson dimness, we all saw it. Shadows moving across the walls, not matching any of our positions. And the whistling started, a slow, tuneless sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We gathered in the main bar area, counting heads obsessively. 7 of us. Dave brought down extra flashlights and blankets, suggesting we all stay together. No one argued. As the night wore on, the shadows became more active. They'd flicker in corners, sometimes forming shapes that almost looked human. The temperature dropped, despite the heating system's constant drone. Old Joe kept checking his watch, growing more anxious as 3 a.m. approached. At 3:15, Amy screamed. The shadows had formed a distinct pattern on the wall, 7 distinct human silhouettes, all hanging at odd angles. As we watched, horrified, one of the shadows began to fade. "Don't fall asleep," old Joe warned. "Whatever happens, don't fall asleep." But Sarah was already nodding off, despite Rachel shaking her. Nothing we did could wake her. Her breathing became shallow, her skin cold to the touch. Her watch stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. The next few minutes were chaos. We tried CPR, called for help on dead phones, shook her desperately. Nothing worked. As dawn approached, the shadows gradually faded, and Sarah's body grew cold. The police blamed it on natural causes, a previously undiagnosed heart condition, they said. They ignored the stopped watch, the other deaths in the bar's history. We all gave statements, but I could tell they didn't believe us about the shadows. I quit the next day. Old Joe disappeared shortly after, leaving town without a word. The young couple, last I heard, were in therapy. Rachel moved away, refusing to talk about that night. Dave sold the bar and moved to Arizona,